All right, so it's 7 o'clock, and so we'll get dinner going here in a second. Dr. Medlin is willing to wait on her dinner till her talk is done, or maybe she has a little food there. And then we can certainly go through the talk and questions, and there'll be a little bit of a business meeting afterwards as well. So Dr. Jennifer Medlin, for those of you who don't know, is here with me at the medical center. She has a lupus clinic where she currently is leading as the local PI on a study on CAR T therapy, which she'll be talking about here. She's a graduate, of UNO. Then she spent her medical school here in Omaha in UNMC, went to Wisconsin, then went to North Carolina for fellowship training and is back with us. And we're ecstatic she's back with us. She's been doing a great job with our lupus clinic, and we're really lucky to have her. So tonight I'll have Dr. Medlin come on up and enlighten us all on CAR T therapy. For those of you who are local who watch the news, you may have seen a little bit of a news story. I couldn't believe it this morning, and I was getting ready, and Brian Mastery was talking about how CAR T therapy has changed the life of a lupus patient. And I thought, this is unbelievable for the day that we actually have our spring meeting to have this on television. So without further ado, I'll have Dr. Medlin come on up and give us our talk.
If you prefer I can I'll take just in case. Yeah, no, I couldn't time that better with that news article coming out. So my name's Jen Medlin. I'm one of the rheumatologists here. So I've been given the task to talk about CAR T cell therapy when autoimmune disease, which is quite a task. So I'm going to kind of break it down into the basics, which kind of helped me understand it. So when I was thrown into this world about a year ago, when I knew we were going to be doing this trial at UNMC, I had a lot to learn and still a lot to learn, but I want to kind of break down how I approached it so I can maybe make this complicated topic a little bit more digestible. So I have no financial disclosures. However, I want to disclose that I am not a hematologist, nor did I ever think I'd be talking about CAR T cell ever. So I'm going to take it from a rheumatology perspective, again, very basic, and help you guys kind of understand maybe why CAR T cell is a potential therapy, how it works, maybe why it works on some of our lupus patients in particular. And then at the end, I will talk about, like, as Dr. Snow had mentioned, we do have actually 2 active CAR T cell trials going on at UNMC that we are actively enrolling. So I'll give you a little bit details about those. So a talk outline. So why? I think the first question is, why are we talking about CAR T cell and rheumatology? So I'll kind of talk about the background of that, and then very basic background immunology to kind of basically understand why a CAR T cell, what it is and why it works. And then we'll go the history of it, adverse effects, obviously, to know about, as this may be a treatment that we'll use in the future for some of our severe systemic autoimmune diseases. I'm going to talk a little bit about lupus because I have to, because that's my thing. So I'm going to talk about lupus and B-cell depletion, maybe why lupus is a great disease to start with. And then we'll talk about our 2 trials. So it all started in 2022. And Nature released an article in October 2022 from Schett and Mackinson, where they did kind of a mini trial at their institution where they treated 5 refractory lupus patients with CAR T cell, CD19 CAR T cell therapy. And when this came out, they're actually not the first lupus patients to get CAR T cell. There's a couple others that were in the literature dating back to like 2019, kind of experimental, but this is like the first big thing that came out when there was 5 patients who had failed lots of medications, had gone into complete remission. So it's kind of like, obviously catches our attention since we all have those lupus patients where we just, even to our best ability, we cannot get them controlled. So obviously it was a big deal. So a little bit about the patient characteristics. There's 5 patients. They're all very young. They all had lupus nephritis, either class 3 or 4. They had all been refractory to multiple medications. So all of them had been on mycophenolate. All of them had been on steroids, obviously. All of them had been on Benlysta. A couple had been on AZA, cyclophosphamide, and 1 person had been rituximab. And despite that, they all still had active disease. And then they're all on background Plaquenil. As all lupus trials, they excluded CNS disease. None of these patients had CNS involvement. And they all had SLEDAI scores of 8 to 16. I don't know how many of you guys use SLEDAI, but basically it's kind of our disease activity measurement scale that we use. So anything over 4 is active. Anything over 8, moderate, over 12 is severe disease. So these people all had moderate to severe. So all patients went into what we call DORIS remission, which is another kind of lingo we're using in the lupus world, where these patients are, to meet DORIS remission with lupus, you have to be off of steroids with a SLEDAI score of 0, or sorry, a prednisone of 5 or less and a SLEDAI score of 0. So all these patients met that criteria after 3 months after they received their infusion. And then they actually have data now up to 3, I think it's actually 3.5. I think the first patient was treated like about almost 4 years ago, with all of them remaining in clinical remission off of treatment. There was one patient that had to get another cycle of cells because they had a recurrence of proteinuria, but it resolved. And none of them had severe adverse effects. We'll talk about the potential adverse effects that we can see with CAR T-cell therapy, which is very common in the cancer world. So far, looks to be maybe it's going to be less risky with our systemic autoimmune patients. And then they had a paper that came out earlier this year that showed that same group has treated now 15 patients, including 8 total lupus and some scleroderma and myositis patients. Again, all of them are in remission. And then all in all, if you look at the literature, there's over 20 patients who've been treated with lupus with CAR T-cell. All of them are in complete remission off of treatment. So obviously that catches our attention. So that's just a little bit of why. And I just wanted to kind of include some of their measurements that they used in this trial. So this is a SLEDAI score. So again, they're all moderate to severe, so 8 to 16, the scores. So we have patient 1 through 5. They all had obviously elevated SLEDAI scores. All of them went to either 0 or near 0 after 3 months of receiving their cells. And then here's just some other measurements where their proteinuria went down, their complements went up, their double-stranded DNA antibodies became undetectable for the most part. And I think the most fascinating thing is their fatigue greatly improved. So that's something I feel like we never touch in our lupus patients. You know, they may clinically be doing really well. Their labs look good. We think they're doing well and they're still tired. So what was fascinating is all these patients' FACIT fatigue scores essentially went down to 0 over time. Okay, so obviously that's impressive. So I wanted to kind of go back to the basics, very basic immunology. I'm sure Dr. Thiel was here. He'd probably want me to go more in detail, but I'm basically just going to go over back to B and T cells. How does a CAR T cell work? What is it made up of? And why is it effective? So T cells. So we have these, they go into the thymus, they mature. They either are CD4 positive or CD8 positive, and they go through both positive selection and negative. So positive selection, if you remember back from the day, a T cell can only recognize an antigen on antigen presenting cell if it is in association with an MHC class molecule. So it has to have that with the antigen that binds to the TCR. So with positive selection, it makes sure that it can recognize its own cells. And then negative selection, you want to make sure it's not too autoreactive, so you're not having autoimmune disease. So once it goes through that, it survives, it goes into the periphery. We have CD8 positive, CD4 positive. The ones that we're going to focus on are CD8 positive because the function of a CAR T cell is a CD8 cytotoxic cell. So again, some more basic immunology. So we have that antigen presenting cell, which in this figure is represented by a dendritic cell. So it has the antigen. It's binding with an MHC class 1. So if it's CD8 positive, you have to have recognized MHC 1 with the TCR. Then you get it activated. And then later on, that CT cytotoxic T cell can go in the periphery. It can recognize that antigen on the surface of another cell, again, in association with MHC. And then it can cause apoptosis. So either through perforins, granzymes, it can cause that cell that attaches to die. So it kills that cell. But there's a lot that goes into it. Again, you have to have that MHC1. The other thing with T cells, and so we don't have autoimmune disease, you have to have not just the primary signal, which is that MHC antigen with the TCR, you also have to have a co-stim, so a secondary signal. So there's lots of different types. The example here is CD8086 with 28, but there's lots of different types, and you may have multiple co-stim signals that are being created to activate that T cell. So there's a lot that goes into a T cell being active so it can actually do its job and cause that apoptosis of that target. Okay, so that's kind of remember. So overview, just remember the positive negative selection. We've got the primary, the secondary signal, and you have to recognize that antigen in association with MHC. So there's a lot that goes into it. And then just remember that CD8 positive T cells, those are the ones we're going to focus on because they can recognize the antigen on cell surface and cause cell destruction. Okay, so then the other part of a CAR T cell is B cells. So B cells, as we all know, make antibodies. And so once they get activated, you first have the immature IgM, IgD. You got class switch and you get mature ones that are IgG, and then eventually down the road, they become plasma cells and they secrete antibodies. So the benefit of antibodies is that they don't have to have that MHC molecule attached. They can recognize the antigen, so it's much more sensitive in recognizing it, attaching its antigen, that it's that antibody. And that's through the single chain variable fragment. So the end part, the heavy and light chains end part of an antibody. So that's the part that can recognize the antigen and bind it. You don't have to have that MHC molecule. So it's a little bit better binding. So that's the part we're going to focus on there. So a CAR T cell, we're going to combine those. So what is a CAR T cell? It's a chimeric antigen receptor T cell. So you have the antigen binding of an antibody. It's much easier to bind and recognize that antigen, bind it. You don't have to have that MHC, but then you have that cytotoxic function of a CD8 positive T cell. So it can bind to, recognize it. It doesn't need that MHC anymore, so it makes it a lot easier. And you also have, at least in the second and third generations, you have a co-stim domain of the CAR T cell, which keeps it activated, so it can actually survive and proliferate. And you don't need to have that co-stim second signal. So here's just an example where you take that variable chain of the antibody where it recognizes the antigen, and then you take the transmembrane and the intracellular domain, signaling domain with the co-stim domain of the T cell, you have a CAR T cell. So that's kind of the essentials. So history. So kind of dates back to the 1980s when they first originated this concept. And in the early 1990s, they found that if you take a retroviral vector, you can introduce these genes to transform T cells into these CAR T cells and fight cancer. So then that led to the first generation of CAR T cells, which did nothing. They did not work. They didn't survive. They didn't proliferate. They failed. So it took another almost 10 years until they actually made the second generation CAR T cell that actually worked. And what they did is they added that co-stim domain so it can actually be activated, survive, and proliferate. So they were able to kill prostate cancer cells with the second generation CAR. And then a year later, they made a CAR cell that was directed toward CD19, which we'll talk about why CD19 too. So I think that's important to know because most of the trials are CD19. There's some other ones, and then in 2017, it took a long time. But in 2017, after multiple trials, it got approved to treat refractory leukemia. So to date, there are 6 autologous CAR T cells treatment that is available for refractory cancers. And then here's just an example. Once we talked about that second generation, it took a while to develop, but once they added that co-stim domains, and since then they've gotten smarter and they've made multiple co-stim domains, so it's a stronger T cell that can survive, proliferate, and kill the target cells. So I mentioned there's 6 autologous CAR T cell therapies that are FDA approved for cancer. All of them that are approved are autologous, but I think it's important to know that there's 2 different CAR T cell treatment umbrellas. There's autologous and there's allogeneic. So autologous is they take the patient's own T cells, they take their own white cells, they engineer them at another lab, they send them back, that patient then gets infused. So they're using their own T cells to generate these CAR cells, and they give them back to the patient. So that's what all of them that are approved. Now, allogeneic's been studied for several years in the cancer world, and now we're starting to do some in the autoimmune world, which I'll talk about. But these are where these T cells are already generated, either through healthy donor cells or through pluripotent stem cells. So they already make them. They're kind of what we call off the shelf. So they're made. They can just give it to the patient. They don't have to do this whole leukapheresis, send to a lab, engineer them, send them back, kind of thing. So those are the two kind of big umbrellas. Again, all of them that have been approved are autologous, but there's trials going on with both of them. So I kind of already alluded to this, but autologous steps, it's a little cumbersome. So they do the leukapheresis, they send the cell, depending on where you have it done. There's some places on site, they have people that can do this, but otherwise they may have to get sent out. Then they have to be engineered, and they have with the retroviral vector, so the inactivated virus brings that gene in, and then it produces a CAR. You have to proliferate, they have to survive, proliferate. You get to a point where you have enough cells, then you have to transport them back. It takes about 2 weeks. And then the patient usually will get what we call preconditioning chemotherapy, which also there's not really great data to why they need this, but this is what they've done in cancer treatments. But it's kind of like to prime the immune system so that its T cells take. But there's really little evidence that we're going off of that's 100% necessary. But they'll either get fludarabine or cyclophosphamide combination or bendamustine, and then they get the infusion. So here's just an example of all the steps it takes. So there's pros and cons of both. Obviously with autologous, we feel maybe a little safer using it because we're thinking we're using their own cells. So maybe there's less risk of graft versus host, which really is probably more host versus graft. And it's been studied more extensively. It's been approved already for malignancy. So we maybe feel a little bit more comfortable doing it. I think the cons are pretty evident. It's time intensive, it's site limitations, and it's expensive. So I think it costs like $500,000 or something close to that for one CAR T cell treatment. Versus allogeneic, the pros would be maybe it's more available, maybe cheaper, again, theoretically, should be maybe cheaper if you have it off the shelf. You don't have to necessarily be at a site that has the expertise to generate these T cells, and it's definitely less time intensive. But I think the cons of it that we are worried about is that maybe they're going to be higher risk for host versus graft disease because they're getting not their cells. Again, I say theoretical here too, because that's not been proven in the cancer trial so far, but obviously more studies are needed. It's still more experimental. So toxicities, and this is true for both allo and auto. So the big ones you guys will read about when you're looking at these studies are CRS and ICANS. Obviously, B cell aplasia is going to happen. You're knocking down their B cells. So that's an evident, infections and all that stuff. So they usually have to go, on the usual when people get, get extensive chemotherapy, they got to go on, antivirals and go on the antibiotics and stuff like that till they generate their B cells again. But other than that, things that are more specific to this CAR T cell treatment. So cytokine release syndrome basically is just uncontrolled production of cytokines and typically driven mostly by IL-6. So these patients can get fevers, they may get liver or kidney issues, hypotension, can range from very mild to severe. And these patients will typically get steroids and toci, and it usually works pretty well. ICANS, or immune effector cell-associated neurotoxicity syndrome, is basically the same thing, except now you're getting those cells going through the blood-brain barrier and they're getting seizures. They may get encephalopathy, maybe even a coma. And the treatment is very similar because, again, it's kind of because of those uncontrolled cytokine release. And I will say in cancer patients, both of these are super common. Like most of them are going to get CRS to some degree. A lot of them, more than 50%, are going to get ICANS. So it's very common. And that's probably because of the cell burden. Like they have huge tumor burden. These people are refractory cancer patients. And so a lot of them are going to get this. This is expected in CAR T cell patients. So I have to say, has not been reported at all, ICANS at all really with our autoimmune diseases, and only mild CRS. So something to be aware of, but at least right now with the limited data we have, that may not be as big of an issue that we're going to see with our patients compared to the cancer patients, which makes sense. The other thing you guys might have read about is that last year, the end of last year, they came out with an FDA black box warning about T cell malignancies and these patients who've received CAR T cell treatment. And this is because when you have that insertion of the gene, if it gets to a certain part of the DNA, it may activate other signaling and it may lead to mutations that cause cancer. So I will say, obviously, this is a concern if you're having secondary malignancies, but I think the thing to remember about this, I think I have some more another thing on here, is that in total, as far as I know, updated, is that there's been 20 reports of T cell malignancies. There's been over 40,000 CAR T cell treatments. So it's 0.0001, something like that, math. But in only a fraction of them, a few of them have been CAR positive. But clearly, that's something we have to be worried about. I think in the cancer world, they're not really concerned about this at all because these patients were already dying of cancer that was refractory to all treatment. And cancer patients are already known to have a higher secondary malignancy risk. So I don't think this is catching the attention really of patients with cancer. But I think for us, that risk benefit may be different because these patients are not people with refractory cancer. So I think this is something that we need to kind of keep watching and evaluating these patients because it's still pretty early. But in general, another study found that about 4.3% of their patients developed secondary malignancies, mostly leukemias. Again, not unexpected because these patients are at higher risk for secondary leukemia, but there's also some skin cancers and some lymphomas discovered. But rarely T cell. So T cell malignancy is the black box warning, but it's rarely a T cell leukemia. So why start with lupus? So lupus is kind of the perfect, I guess, autoimmune disease to think about with this. So one, we know we're not great at treating lupus. So up to 30% of our patients with renal disease end up needing a transplant or going on dialysis and at least having chronic kidney disease. And we know that this disease is characterized by antibody and immune complex production. So we know if we get the B cells, theoretically, we should really be able to help these patients and get rid of those antibodies. We also know that current B cell therapies, while they work for some, which is helpful. They don't work for everybody. So belimumab and rituximab are effective for some, but not for everybody. And then what came of this too, and why they started thinking about using it in humans, is they have a couple murine mouse models that have come out that with people with mice that had lupus, and they seem to survive and seem to respond to anti-CD19 CAR T cell treatment. So I think a question a lot of people had, I know when I've talked to Jeff and Lynn, they kind of said, well, why is CD19 a better, thing to go after than CD20? Why, if they didn't respond to CD20 B cell depletion, why are they going to respond to CD19? I think we don't 100% know, but some theories behind it is that CD19 is going to cover a broader range of B cells. So we know CD20 are not going to be present on long-lived plasmablasts, whereas CD19 is. So it maybe leads to more significant B cell depletion. The other thing is it probably gets into the tissues better. So you've got CD19 positive T cells or B cells that are in like the lymphoid tissue, the kidneys, and I can get to those and destroy those more. And why they found in Mackinson's, I didn't mention this, but in Mackinson-Schett's paper study, they found that these patients actually retained their antibodies from vaccines, and that's because those are the plasma cells. So those plasma cells are not affected. So once they become plasma cells, they don't have CD19 markers on them anymore. So that was maybe one reason why they maybe still have good vaccine responses and can still, have those antibodies. So those are one thought, is it maybe it leads to more, complete B cell depletion. So the theory behind CD19 CAR T cell therapy is that it leads to this immune reset. It wipes out all those antibodies. You start fresh with these naive B cells. You still have your plasma cells that have some of those antibodies for protection. And it's kind of like a reset for these patients. So back to the Mackinson. So talking about that, these patients did have their CD19 B cells kind of watched. And you can see within a day, basically, their CD19 were wiped out. So it's very effective at what its goal is. That target CD19, it's recognizing, it's destroying those cells. So it's incredibly effective at getting rid of those. And then they also were like, okay, so when are they going to repopulate their B cells? Because obviously we want some B cells around for these patients. We don't want them to be B cell aplasia forever. So they found that around 110 days on average was when their B cells came back. And they mostly came back naive, which we'll talk about here. So before, they had, red is IgG, IgA is blue, and you've got the IgM that's like that teal green color. So before they got treated, they had mostly IgG, IgA, some IgM. But then afterwards, it was mostly IgM, a little bit IgD as well. So the naive B cells, because you're wiping out those IgG cells. So in summary, CAR T cell therapy is when you take it's a cellular therapy where you genetically engineer a T cell. You take the good parts of the CD8 cytotoxic T cells with the antigen recognition of a B cell, of an antibody, and you can create different targets that you want it to hit. You can either do autologous, where you take their patient's own cells, you engineer them, you give them back, or allogeneic, where you're using donated cells or stem cells to be created and give to them off the shelf. Adverse effects, be aware of basically cytokine releases, whether CRS or ICANS, and obviously secondary malignancy risk we're going to have to look at in the future to see how that's going to translate to our autoimmune patients and whether that risk is worth it or not. And then, but like I said, it might be an option, especially for our severe refractory autoimmune diseases by causing an immune reset, including lupus. There's also some other studies going on. So speaking of that, I figure this is a good platform, a good time to talk about our CAR T cells. So UNMC, we have two active CAR T cell trials going on. They're both CD19 targeted. One's allo for lupus, one's auto for technically lupus, but we're trying to do that in the allo, or scleroderma myositis. So I was going to talk about both of them, just so you're aware. If you have patients that maybe would fit the criteria, send them our way. We're happy to screen them and chat with them. So for the allo, this is the one that I run. Me and Matt Lunning are running. So this is anti-CD19. It's allo, meaning they just get it off the shelf. We don't have to do leukapheresis. We give them to them off the shelf, and then they're done. So the inclusion criteria, fairly strict inclusion-exclusion criteria. So obviously we're going to start with younger people that maybe have less, risk for having some adverse effects. So 18 to 40, it used to be 18 to 40. We got them to let us do 18 to 45. They have to have moderate, at least SLEDAI score, or lupus with a SLEDAI score of at least 8, which is good. We're not going to be treating people who are not really sick lupus with this. And they have to have either renal, pulmonary, or cardiac involvement or vasculitis. So we're not, if they just have bad skin, they just have, CNS disease, that did not qualify. And then they have to have failed, obviously, glucocorticoids or not get into a reasonable dose. So there's no like set, like they've had to been on this many glucocorticoids and get down to this dose. I think we all agree long-term glucocorticoids aren't great for our lupus patients. So if they can't get off of them and only respond to higher doses, you can't get them off, that counts. But they also have to fail 2 other medications for at least a 3-month duration. So I'm assuming most of these patients have failed more than that. And it doesn't really necessarily matter other than you can't count methotrexate and AZA as 2 separate ones. Those are the same. So you can't count those as the 2 medications they've been on. But I'm assuming most of these people are going to have been on cyclophosphamide and mycophenolate and rituximab and all that stuff. And then exclusion criteria, this is where the FDA came in, and some of the stuff I don't agree with, but unstable vital signs, which are pretty low and exclude some of our nephrotic patients. But I think it's like if they have a systolic over 160, over 90, pulse over 100. But, and then GFR has to be less than 50. Their LFTs can't be more than 3 times. They can't have AEF less than 40. Those are reasonable. And then the other one I kind of have an issue with is having a UPC over 8 grams, but FDA regulated, we can't change it. And then we're excluding CNS involvement as most lupus trials. And so these patients, the other thing is they have to be down to 10 milligrams of prednisone on intervention time. So they can be on prednisone, they just have to go down to 10 at the time of treatment. And then they do receive preconditioning treatment, though this is kind of a moving target because again, we don't quite know if these patients actually need it. So they can either get cyclophosphamide or fludarabine for a few days before or bendamustine for 2 days. And they're admitted to the hospital, they get the cells, and then we watch them for 72 hours to make sure they don't have any concerns or any issues. Then they go home and it's just a lot of outpatient follow-up. And we're monitoring them very closely for 2 years, but then it's a 15-year extension trial for safety. So that's the allo lupus one. If you guys have anyone that maybe you think meets criteria, send them my way. We have treated 1 patient, so I think I can say that now. She was in the news yesterday. And Dr. Snow was mentioning this morning as well. So one of my lupus patients, who was very refractory, kidney, lung. She was 27 when we treated her. She's 28 now. She's had lupus since she was a teenager. Failed everything. She'd been on everything minus cyclophosphamide because of some liver disease. So she got bendamustine. She didn't get cyclophosphamide flu, and she has done remarkably well. So she's pain-free, fatigue-free, off of medicines other than Plaquenil. So she's about 6 months out, and she didn't have any ICANS or CRS at all. So far it's only an N of 1, but if that makes any of your patients feel a little bit more comfortable. And then the second trial, Dr. Feely is the PI for this. So this is an auto. So this is when they're going to take their own cells, do that leukapheresis, engineer them, and give them back. And there's both myositis and scleroderma. There's technically lupus too, which if your patient feels more comfortable with that, we can certainly think about enrolling them. We're just trying to get those into the allo. But for the myositis, the criteria, and Mike, definitely tell me if I'm missing something, but they have to have either severe active or skin or muscle disease, proof of activity. So basically a muscle biopsy, EMG, CK that's elevated without any other explanation. And the same kind of thing, the ongoing theme is that they've had to fail 2 other medications plus steroids for at least 3 months. And I think they're excluding all polymyositis, inclusion body, amyopathic, drug-induced. If they have severe damage with their muscles, you don't think they're going to get it back. Cardiac involvement, if they're TIF1 and diagnosed within a year, or if they're MDA5 positive with ILD, they're excluding those. And then for scleroderma, disease duration of 5 years or less, they have to have a modified run and skin score of at least 15, and then an increase of 3 units or 1 new body area and elevated CRP or SED rate. This one's a little bit more intensive. And then progressive ILD of less than 5 years with inadequate response, similar to the others. And they're excluding, I think, pulmonary hypertension patients on treatment. If they have rapidly progressive GI involvement, or if they've had scleroderma renal crisis, they're excluded. So there's probably a lot more details. I'm sure Mike would know more than me, but if there's any other things you want them to know. But otherwise, contact us if you have any patients that are interested and you think might qualify. We can always give them for a screening. But yeah, so questions? This is my obligatory, I don't have children, so these are my children. These are my cat children. So I'm the resident crazy cat lady here. So, okay, questions? Hopefully I was able to like simplify the thing a little bit more, but I'm happy to answer any questions you guys may have. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How soon after?
the CRS is usually pretty quick. So that's why that's more often. That's why we're doing the 72 hour, is because you should see that pretty quick. The ICANS can be a little delayed. So we actually do ICANS testing, which is kind of silly. Amy was doing the testing on my patient, and like the questions they have to ask, my patient's like, okay, duh. But she had to do that, I think, for like, I think the first month or something like that. It wasn't too long, but it's usually more of an earlier. So that's the thought of like, well, how long do we actually have to watch these people in the hospital? And I think it may come down to if we find that our patients aren't really having a lot of these effects, because maybe it's a smaller burden of cells that they're just getting destroyed. Maybe we won't even have to watch them in the hospital. I think that's one thought, but yeah, but it's typically more kind of in the early part. But yeah, I know it's very common with cancer, so it's kind of been shocking to see our patients don't really seem to be getting it so far. Yeah.
The studies that you have done for the how many years ago, how long, like years out, like patients remain off of treatment?
Yeah, so the Mackinson Chet one, I know for sure that first lady they treated, I think she's like, was towards the end of 4 years ago. So she's coming up on 4 years. And the last report was at 3.5 years, and she was completely in remission off of treatment. I think some of the other ones were more like around 2 years when they came out with their paper, I think in January of this year. So, but I think one of the arguments initially was like, well, these patients are getting pre-treatment with like a bunch of cyclophosphamide if you do that regimen. So like, well, maybe some of this early improvement is just they got like chemotherapy level cyclophosphamide, which I think is reasonable. It's a question that we probably all have. But the fact that they've stayed in remission, I think probably takes that away. And interesting enough, that's why I was interested to see my patient. She did not get that. She got bendamustine, which is not a lupus medicine, and she's done remarkably well. So, but I think that's definitely a question people have had. It's like, well, let's see how far this actually lasts.
So the study is that there was one patient that was retreated.
I think there was one, and I think it was just for proteinuria, and I don't know how far, I have to look back to see how far out it was, but I think there was one patient where the proteinuria started going up again. I think they gave them cells again, and then they were fine. Yeah, that I don't know, and I don't think they rebiopsied or anything like that to see, is it active or is this something else going on? But yeah, I don't know all the details of that, but I know it's just like a little bit of proteinuria. They just retreated him and he was fine. But yeah, I don't think so. So our trial, I think, is going to have a dose escalation. So right now they're seeing, because they said, well, maybe we don't have to retreat these people, but I think there's going to be a clause where they could be retreated and dose escalation. Because I think we're still trying to figure out too, what's the right dose for these people. So my patient got 360 million cells, but who knows if that's the right dose or not. So I think it's a moving target for sure. Yeah, but yeah.
When you go for the auto, what's the timing? So like, do they put them in the hospital initially and then they come back? How do they, you know how that works as far as timing?
I know. Oh, for like the trial, I don't know on that one. I don't think they'd have to be hospitalized for. I'm assuming the leukapheresis probably happens as an outpatient, because I know then they have to do the cells. I think they do the cells here, though, is my understanding. Mike might know more than me on that one. But then they would be hospitalized for the actual treatment. Mike, do you happen to know how long they're hospitalized for the auto one after they get cells? Is it? Oh, geez. Okay. Okay. I'll see. That's another. Yeah. Ours, my allo, they just get the cell, they get the pre-treatment so she got her bendamustine in the infusion center and then came back on Monday, got hospitalized, got cells, and then she just left 3 days later. So they have to be, it's 2 or 3 weeks, like they get hospitalized that whole time, or they just get leukapheresis and they're watched for 2 to 3 weeks after they get cells. Oh, that's the whole thing. Okay. They're not hospitalized the whole time though, are they? Oh, they are, maybe because of the leukapheresis part to watch. Okay. Well, that's a big commitment. Yeah. So I guess that makes sense, I guess, if they're doing the leukapheresis and having to watch them for infections and stuff, but so. No. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Medlin, for that great talk. Obviously, anybody who has any questions regarding this, we're a small group. If anybody needs emails, we can always provide that. We've worked and we've talked in the past. Let Carmen do this. We've talked in the past about getting an email list or a contact list for rheumatologists in the state. If that's something that people still have, would like to have, we can certainly work on that. Because obviously we're a small group and we fight the same battles day in and day out. So I think it would be a good idea, but as we move forward, something to think about, but please always reach out to us and we can certainly do or move forward if you think that's something we could do. So real briefly, we'll excuse our vendors real briefly here. And then we'll have a brief business meeting. I promise I won't keep you too terribly long, but we have one issue to discuss and we'll try to get us all home before our bedtime. So we'll give about a 5-minute break here, then we'll reconvene here in a couple minutes. Question isn't too good to be true, but even if it's only 4 or 5 years remission, like that is quality. But even so, like you can get someone 5 years and they're like no accumulated damage, like. So if you didn't hear the question in our room that barely needs a microphone, for this study, all study costs are incurred by the sponsor. So this is not run through insurance. So
Yeah.
yeah. All right, great. So we're going to go through a brief business meeting here. Just administrative update here. Our membership is up to 49. So we continue to increase. I think that obviously, hopefully that bodes well for our future. Our finances are steadily increasing right now. We're up to about $67,000 in the bank. If you look year by year, and I'll have in the next slide, we'll talk about how much we're increasing per year. The board, we've had a discussion about spending policy because I think that $67,000 is great, but the question is what are we going to do to help our specialty in the state and with that, and I think that's something that I'd like to discuss here in the next slide. So if you look at our income, right now we're spending about 54% of our income per year. So putting on these meetings costs money. Having sponsors brings in money. So generally these meetings are significantly positive towards our bottom line. Obviously there are dues, but dues make up a small percentage of our income. And you can look here at our expenses and income, and obviously going back, some of this is pandemic data, but in the end, net is somewhere between about $18,000 a year is what we're bringing in. Now that may change. Industry may not be sponsoring events like this like they used to. The world's changing a little bit. Maybe it's not. We had a robust number of vendors here at our previous meeting. As biosimilars kind of, whatever biosimilars do, we might not see quite the number of vendors we saw because there was a big push when biosimilars are hitting the market. But we just don't know what industry, and if we're relying on that, I think by itself, I think that we just need to kind of be watching that. And I think that the ACR is, I have some involvement in the ACR, and we've seen some of that nationally, but it's not like a huge dramatic trend. But everyone's trying to figure out what's going to happen post-pandemic. Everyone's trying to figure that out. And I think that having meetings, I think, is important. I think it's important for all of us to be in the room, but I think if you look at, what we're bringing in, how we look at the future, I think it's important just to think that just because it is this way now may not be this way in a couple of years. So, as I mentioned, our current balance is $67,000 a year, net income around $15,000 to $20,000 a year. So we met as a board and we talked to Carmen, and we really relied on Carmen's expertise on this because she works with a number of societies in the state. I don't think, how many do you work with? 15? She works with 15 different societies across the state of Nebraska. So part of the reason we're meeting tonight is that between Carmen's schedule and my schedule, this is the only Thursday night that existed until around Christmas time. So she is putting on a lot of miles and a lot of time with this, but her expertise really was helpful to kind of ask her, what do other groups do? And the answer really was, they're all different. And some spend a lot of money on lobbying and within our state. And so that's something we can think about. I mean, the NMA does an amazing job on our behalf. So a big plug for being an NMA member. If you are not, that money does directly benefit you. Again, I would highly recommend ACR membership as well. And giving to NMA has a PAC, ACR has a PAC, Political Action Committee. These are things that do affect your bottom line. They do affect the field of rheumatology. We had a recent pediatric loan repayment bill that came through Congress. You know, our lobbying was on behalf of the pediatric rheumatologist. Ultimately, after years of pushing, that kind of got pushed across the finish line. So I'll get off my soapbox on that, but I think it's important to think about that moving forward. And so other things we talked about is growing our field. And I think that there was a lot of agreement that building for the future and the young table over here, you know, is our future, and getting people to meetings, getting people involved in our organization is important. And I think we've seen really good, we have really good evidence of that in our city and in our state practicing. Get young people involved when they're in their early stages of their training, whether that's when they're students, is wonderful. And, you know, and obviously internal medicine and pediatric residents moving forward, I think is really key. And so one thing that we thought is, in today's world, I talked about industry changing. You may not know this, but in the past, to get fellows to the ACR meeting, Amgen had a huge grant. So when I was a fellow, makes me sound old, which I guess I'm getting there, but when I was a fellow, like, that was covered. So the training program didn't have to pay the cost of the hotel. There was a fund they could go to get that covered. And so now that is back on the fellowships. And so it's something that nationally the ACR is trying to figure out how to handle this. The RRF actually has a FIT fund that you can donate directly to. And so there are ways that we're trying to support this and fill that void. But I think that is something that we talked about on the board. And one of the things we recommended was that the establishment of 2 scholarships of $1,500 per year. This will be for the first year only. And to allow the training programs here to help support getting a fellow to the meeting, or a resident to the meeting, or a student to the meeting. And we left it at trainees to be very broad for that reason. And so obviously the sponsoring, the person who fills out the application, you know, would just basically have to explain the costs and verify the costs. Getting into once you get to the meeting and pay for the hotel, which obviously if you haven't gone to Convergence, obviously hotels are $300 anymore now a night. Airfare is going to be $600, $700 to get to, depending on when you buy it, to get to DC. You start that cost add up pretty quickly. So $1,500 may not cover everything, but if we can help support and allow that to be less of a burden on the sponsoring institution, I think that would be helpful. And so that was something that the board recommended. We chose $1,500 because if you add up the number 2 here, which is a donation to the RRF Research Rheumatology, or the Rheumatology Research Foundation, of $2,000, you add that up, it's $5,000. And we felt like that was a safe number. If we're bringing in close to $20,000 a year, $5,000 to begin for this year, as a way to help give back and help build our specialty statewide and potentially nationally, but more statewide. We're thinking that would be a good starting place. I skipped over the top line here that since we have $67,000 sitting in a bank account that probably generates 0.1% of interest. We and Carmen, and actually we're going to be finishing this here in the next couple of days. We'll be putting $10,000 into a CD, just getting 5%. My hope would be at some point we can have money getting 5%, that we can take that 5% out every year and have net basically be giving back to our specialty with interest. among other things. But that was his way to start, because we don't think that even if you doubled our, you have basically no income for 2 years, we still would not be losing money, and even that $10,000 would not need to be touched. Thoughts, discussion, disagreements?
There, account for the 67. That'll gain a little more than just like, so there are some accounts out there like 2%, 3%.
So it's a money market account, so it does earn something,
Okay,
but
it's not.
it's not much, and so
Most money markets are about 2%.
2%, I think, is what we're earning.
But the only question is whether or not you put 20,000 into the CD, or maybe what you do is you stagger the CD so that, you know, maybe next year put another 10,000 in.
But they don't miss it.
Just, yeah, they don't trip same time. But that would end up paying ultimately for more scholarships or. Perpetuating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our discussion on the board was, I wanted to be more aggressive, but at the same time, since this was our first kind of time doing this, I didn't want to, I don't think anybody wanted to like get ahead of ourselves here. I think we should, I think you just mentioned like staggering it, finding a way.
1 year, that doesn't lock you in forever,
No.
especially if you stagger.
So I think that we can work with folks. We're one of two. We're the only, you're the second organization that you've worked with that does this.
Yeah.
So it's kind of unique in that regard, but I think that that's a great idea. That was kind of my thinking too. Application process, I think we can work up the details. I think that I really want to make sure that we support all in the state in this regard, that have ideas to someone they could send. And so certainly, all those who are involved in education or deal with trainees, feel free to email us or reply, and we're going to have a small basic application process that hopefully will take not terribly long. Now, I guess the bigger question is if you approve. And so we, as a board, we didn't want to just start spending money. There are stories of societies across our country that have dissolved because the board started spending money without talking to the membership. So I want to make sure that everybody is engaged here. So if there's any discussion, let's discuss it. If not, we can vote on this. And then moving forward, we can certainly continue to discuss this and hopefully open this up a little bit more to be able to give back more.
Marcus, so the trainees, that's not just rheumatology, that could be an internal medicine resident.
Correct.
Who's been here, who just wants to go. This is not specifically fellows, correct?
Correct. That was my intention of writing, trainees when I kind of had this original proposal for the board. But again, that's up for debate here, but I thought trainees is any stage. And so if there's a resident, or even a medical student that we think has some, I think that we should, my intention was to help support the state of Nebraska, meaning that if they're training here, or if they have ties here, then I would consider that to help the state of Nebraska and get that interest.
These are students or residents that have interest in rheumatology.
Correct. For a reason to go. I mean, at our institution, if we have students who work on a research project, we foot the bill to get them there. And we find the money. And there are ways, there's ways internally that we do that comes from the academic mission of the Nebraska Medical Center, but we foot the bill for that. And I don't want this just to be a UNMC thing. This is not like, I'm gonna be very clear. This is not just a UNMC thing. If there's a Creighton student, or there's a college student who has some interest in immunology, who's worked with someone and we think that there's an interest there that we could try to, build up, then have, someone sponsor them, a member sponsor them, fill out the application and let's do it. That's how I was thinking of this. Because we think that's been well demonstrated. If you build that interest early on, the chances of having someone end up in a rheumatology fellowship grows exponentially. And getting third-year residents with their first exposure to rheumatology is where you don't have that. That's where you fail. So the earlier on, the better. Okay, so I guess I'll just call for a vote. So if you're in favor, raise your hand. And if you're okay, wonderful. I think that passes. So great. And so what we'll try to do is we'll try to bring this up in the future. If you guys have, if you have ideas on, you know, opening this up a little bit, I think that as we look at our finances next year, we can certainly look at this, but we wanted to do this kind of as a 1-year thing. I'd love to have a spending plan, meaning that we have a mathematical formula. We look at things and we say, okay, this is what we have. X% of this equals, you know, $6,700. That's what we're going to spend this year. Like, I would love to have a spending plan that we think is fiscally safe. So, and we'll kind of work on that regard, and Carmen's been a great help in that regard. All right, that's that. And then additional funding request. RRF has been sending out information. Again, I think that if this is from them, basically, if you go to Convergence, you know, the ACR annual meeting, the donors lounge, if you give to the RRF, you can go to the donors lounge. If you donate over $500 for the year, I will tell you, you get probably $100 to $200 back in like coffee and food if you ever do that, by the way, because to spend $6 on a you know, a muffin that's been shrink wrapped, you know, from a place 500 miles away, it certainly is no fun. But you go to the donors lounge, you can get this here. If you donate this, you can actually give a mentor or mentee a day pass up to the donors lounge. So the thought being is that if you know, bring kind of the next generation in of people who have not been able to donate in the past, due to the fact they're in training, this would be a way to kind of have to show them the appreciation that the RRF has for those who donate. Questions, thoughts, things we should do, things we shouldn't do.
I think at the Convergence, the Community Practice Council at GACR is, they're going to have at least 1 or 2 people that are in private practice there for one of the forums so people want to stop by and find out more about private practice and what life is like, you know, outside of a university or other teaching kind of system. The other thing, what we're also kind of brainstorming at this time is developing a private practice mentoring program.
Awesome.
So for people that are interested in considering that option as they finish their fellowship, that'll be I think that's a work in progress right now, but I see that in the future really quick.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, so the Community Practice Council, for those who don't know, the ACR established this as a way for the community practice to have those in community practice who are, you know, not only busy seeing patients, they're busy running a business and you know, being there for their family, allows them to have input and their input. Maybe their voices haven't been heard as much because they didn't have the time in the past. And certainly it's been wildly successful. Rick's part of that. So Rick, if you have any information on that comes across, just send it to Carmen or me. I'll be on the lookout too. If I see it come across, we'll try to get it out to those involved, especially our trainees.
Partly, let's see what the dates and time of it. I heard it was going to be Sunday, but I'm not absolutely sure about that.
Okay.
But I'll check into that and I'll email both of you.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah. I may see here this weekend. So,
Okay.
but if I do, if I get that information, I'll forward it on. Yeah. So I am going to the CSRO meeting in the future. If anybody's interested, I would highly recommend it. This year it's in Nashville. And the CSRO will pay for airfare and lodging. So it's basically you give your time and that's all you have to give to go. So, and we can sponsor more than one member. Our state society, we may have to have a vote. If we do have more than one person go, we may just have to have a vote. The society would pay for the other person to go if we exceed the costs. But yeah. All right. Well, any other questions, let me know. But if not, we'll close the business meeting here and wish everyone a great night and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Martin.